Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today for the first of two lunch and learning sessions to provide awareness of teen dating violence. Before we get started, I wanted to remind everyone that the session will be recorded and edited to take my blooper out. And I'll send out information on how to access the link. It will find its way to our department's YouTube page eventually. And communications takes care of that, and they are extremely busy. So that's one of those things that when we get it ready, we'll send it to them and then they'll post it and let us know when it gets posted. For those of you who need closed captioning, you can access that through the More tab at the far right at the bottom of your screen. Click it and the three little dots, and it should open options so that closed caption will be active. Will activate for you. For consideration of all here, please mute yourself so that we don't have background sound competing with our presenters. And we will be also asking you to complete a short survey at the end of the meeting. Of course, I will send out the link again at a later point, but it should populate when you close the Zoom meeting. It should populate in your browser, though some people on their systems, they don't like to do that extra little pop-up. I will also have a QR code on one of the last slides of the day for you to access it that way if you'd like. It's a really important thing for us to be able to improve future trainings by evaluating what we have done in the past. Do we have any additional questions before we get started or during the presentation? Please feel free to put those in the chat. Some of my co-team will help monitor that while Emil is presenting. So let's get this show on the road. And I want you guys to put an answer to these check-in questions in the chat. Let us know who we're talking to. Give us an idea of who this audience is. What is your name? Especially if you are logging in with a phone number rather than a name on the screen. That would be helpful. Where are you at? What part of Virginia or part of the country are you at? These sessions get advertised on the OVC website, so we never know where people are coming from. And why did you choose to attend today's session? Are you a parent of a teen and you want to get an idea on what's good things to know when your teenagers are navigating today's dating scene? Are you a service provider, a teacher at a school? Do you work with teens in your job? Let us know why you chose to come today. That helps us navigate what kind of things to look at in the future. So feel free to put all that in the chat, and that will be very, very helpful for us. And while you guys are doing that, we are going to introduce our team here as well. The folks that I have with us. Emily, will you introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Emily Sadie with the Victim Services Unit. We're really grateful to have all of you here today, especially Emil. Thank you for being here to present to us. We always get very enlightening and informative presentations from you and your organization. So we're grateful to have you here, and thank you to Deirdre for setting this up. Looking forward to hearing more about this topic.
And Beth, if you would, please.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Beth Couch. I'm the regional advocate here in the Southwest for the Department of Corrections, and I too am here for Emil. Fantastic presentations always, so looking forward to it.
Awesome. And of course, a lot of you already know who I am. I am Deirdre Hasty Martin with the Department of Corrections Victim Services Unit and our Community Engagement and Training Coordinator. And last but not least, I am going to stop sharing my screen and I am going, did I make that stop?
I got it.
I gave Emil power. I told him he could take over. And so, Emil, if you would introduce yourself and let's continue this show.
Absolutely. So, some of you already know me. Obviously, it's great to see everybody. Those of you that already do know me, and those of you who don't. So, my name is Emil Morris. I'm a community outreach specialist down here in southwestern Virginia in the New York Valley. And I'll go a little bit over our services, how I interact with teenagers, both in a direct support and an educational sort of development capacity in my role, because I'm at a 30-person agency, which to some of you in the victim services field may sound enormous, and to some of you at VADOC might sound minuscule. It just really depends on who we're kind of talking to here. But I'm going to do my very best here to, let's see, share up my slides. And as I said in the chat already, this should be correct. Allow. Okay. That should be all right. Now, do we all see this correctly? Do we see the slide?
Yes, looks good. Looks good.
And do we see my presenter notes?
No.
Okay, perfect. Then we've got it going.
And we've done it right.
So, I am not a parent myself. However, I am a proud former teenager. And in my capacity at the Women's Resource Center, we do a lot of direct service. So what we do over here at the WRC is serve secondary and primary victim survivors of partner violence, dating violence, trafficking, and stalking. And we were the first shelter of resource in Virginia. We've been doing that since 1977. So that said, despite the gendered nature of our names, we do see all kinds of people. I mean, we respond in an emergency advocacy capacity to PREA calls from the jail. We respond to child abuse, caregiver violence, sexual assault, all these things. That we're very fortunate to have a good amount of hospitals that do provide forensic services, because not all areas have that. Surprisingly, for our area, if you're familiar with Radford, Virginia Tech, the closest hospital to Virginia Tech, for example, doesn't offer those services. So in some ways, we're very blessed, and in other ways, there's still a ways to go. Given the nature of the work that I do, my presentation will necessarily discuss violence. I always like to say that explicitly. This can be rough, especially if you are a parent and you're hoping that things weren't as they are. That sounds a bit cynical, but sometimes that happens. So we're going to talk about especially technological risks to young people. Some of this may be stuff you've already encountered. I know I saw in the chat just earlier that somebody's from a child advocacy center. I think that that's something that a lot of you probably have already encountered a lot. But I will say that there is a generational gap and a struggle when it comes to accessing technology and understanding technology. And that doesn't always pan out in the way you might be imagining. Young people today actually have less of an understanding about technology than young people did 15 or even 20 to 30 years ago. Technology has changed to where somebody who's using technology a lot of the time will often have the apps built out for them. You know, these are not folks who are defragmenting disks. These are not folks who are sometimes even know how to open a folder or find something in a C drive, right? That is served up to you now, and they really don't understand. And therefore, there are some serious issues with understanding of network security, understanding of how the internet works, right? So you as a parent, you as an adult may actually be in a better place to understand the fundamental nature of technology than your teenager might be. And I know that's not always the narrative that we're sort of sold, but that is something that I have observed consistently. We'll talk about trauma, of course. We'll talk about ACEs, of course. We'll talk about resiliency, of course, all that good stuff. And of course, a little bit of our services again, so you understand where I'm coming from. We're probably best known for our hotline. It's 24/7. Most dual service domestic sexual violence agencies have services that are similar to or comparable to ours. Everything we do is free and confidential as is legally possible, right? And what we term trauma-informed, which I will define later, because there's nothing that bothers me more in a presentation when somebody comes into a space and says a word like informed consent, trauma informed, or resiliency. And it doesn't tell us what they mean when they say those words. I think that can be a boundary to good communication. So I'm going to try to be really diligent about defining how we're talking about these things, what we mean when we're discussing them. We have our emergency shelter and transitional housing. Those are for folks who are in imminent danger due to partner sexual violence, any of these issues. The length of stay varies. I've seen personally folks, when I've been on the hotline, we're doing a shelter intake, they come in, they get checked in, and then they go out and they see a family member they haven't seen in a long time who hears about what's going on and says, "Hey, come with me," right? And they check out that same day. That's okay. We've also had folks stay for months while they're waiting on paperwork, while they're waiting on court proceedings and things like that. It just depends on an individual's need and situation. It's very much like a dorm living situation sometimes, and I apologize if you can hear the train in the background here. As I said, we are in southwestern Virginia. It does vary by somebody's need. So it can be anywhere from a day to quite a while. Cornerstone is 18 months, if I'm not mistaken. They're very much normal apartments. Those are a great way that folks can get back on their feet. We're blessed to have those. We're very lucky because people can live there for free with their families. They're obviously non-offending family members, right? And get savings reestablished. Part of the coercive control, and we'll define that as well. The coercive control that we so often witness involves financial control, which doesn't really have as many legal options. It's similar to stalking in that way, where it can be a real struggle to extricate people from those systems. We also provide advocacy, primarily in the emergency and legal fields. We're not obviously nurses or lawyers, but we have seen many, many, many protective orders filled out. And I personally am on the emergency advocacy team. We respond to those hospitals I mentioned before. For us, that's Carilion, Radford, and Giles, as well as Lewis Gale, Pulaski, and the Safe Center of Pulaski. Forensic services are steadily sort of tracking westward in southwestern Virginia, and northward, but it's not uncommon for us to see clients from North Carolina, even Kentucky, Tennessee, a lot from West Virginia as well, because people are just traveling to where they know these services are available. We provide counseling, education, volunteering. Most of those are self-explanatory. Please don't feel too obligated to read the nitty-gritty of the slides. It's pretty, it is what it is. We provide groups. That's for youth and adults. Again, COVID changed a lot of the way we provide our services. Some of that was for the better. We got more access to telehealth services, to being able to meet online with clients and things like that. And that helps a lot because we serve Radford, Floyd County, Pulaski County, Giles County, Montgomery County, and Radford City. So if you live out in Narrows, it might be a 45-minute drive down to your counseling appointment, where you're there for an hour and then you're driving 45 minutes back, right? Same thing for Floyd. So you're spending more time, right, in the car than you were in counseling. And that's to say nothing of the transportation issues that a lot of our clients face. So we're continuously reevaluating, continuously developing, and becoming more expansive and inclusive. We're doing our best to walk the walk and talk the talk. We're expanding language access, all that great stuff, like a lot of other agencies are doing across the state. But it is a developing field, right? The trauma field is a developing field. And in fact, it is a relatively young field. And that brings me to my first question. And Dee, I will say we'll give it just a couple minutes. I want to know your opinion. What is trauma, right? I say our services are trauma informed. We're going to talk about trauma today. What do I mean? What is trauma? If you had to define it, and I know you're online, so please don't cheat. But if you just had to give a colloquial definition to a friend who's sitting across from you at the table and saying, I don't even know what people are talking about when they're saying this, how would you define it? And then, Dee, if you could read some of those out when we get some, that would help me.
Certainly. We're waiting on the little time lapse that it takes for people to type their answer and it to
To
come up
process,
in the
yeah.
chat, of course. And I haven't typed mine, but I would say it's like an experiential vent, something that happens out of the normal that causes stress or distress or harm or a need for something else, just as a anecdotal answer.
Right. And I think that answer would certainly get across to any one of the victims that you're working with, like what they're looking at. I like that definition because it's very expansive as well. A lot of times when folks are thinking about trauma, especially when I come in the room and I'm like, hey, we do sexual violence, partner violence, trafficking, and stalking, right? I've sort of preloaded an answer in people's head, right? But in truth, trauma is incredibly common. Any incident, any event, as you sort of said, that's leaving a long lasting negative impact on folks, the way that they live their lives, that's giving them worse outcomes, like that is a traumatic event. And that can be a flood, it can be intimate partner violence, it can be exposure to combat or the constant threat. I mean, this is something that a lot of our teenagers are dealing with right now. You know, how many of your teenager schools have active shooter drills, right? That can
Right.
be a source of stress and trauma for young people, you know.
And I like this definition that Tammy's put in the chat: emotional and physical stress after some type of unhealthy incident.
Absolutely. Yes, that's a great one. Hello, Gary. Emotionally connected experience a person cannot shut off. Right. Exactly. It's not a question. And this has been a struggle with veterans too, right? The idea in our society, we tend to be so independent, right? That we feel like if we're having this emotional response, if we're having this negative outcome, it's our fault. And we need to restrain ourselves more or fix it or somehow be better. And that
Mhm.
extends to young people, to teenagers. And that is a tall order if you're 45 years old and have a counseling degree, right? Let alone if you're 14, right? And you're just trying to pass geometry. You know,
Exactly.
we don't, as I said, always walk the walk that we wish we did. And that is even acknowledging that not everybody has the language to think about trauma, to discuss what trauma is. Mental health services historically are stigmatized, right? Having a mental health diagnosis was a stigmatized thing. And that stigma is lowering. That's a significant difference from how it was, again, 20, 40 years ago. We still have a distance to go in understanding the way that we work and the way that we respond. So trauma-informed care prioritizes the fact that we've all in some way, and maybe it's trauma we've recovered from, or maybe it isn't, we've in some way experienced trauma. You know, we have had that terrible car accident, that natural disaster, that combat exposure, the experience of poverty, sexual violence, stalking, and and we'll talk again about digital exploitation later, but many of us have been touched by this. Again, society has a long way to go. We've come a long way. There's still a long way to go in making the world safe for everybody, especially for young people. Thank you for your answers. Another thing that I'd like to point out too is that when we're teaching Peaceline, when we're doing education, it was on the slide before this. So that's our violence prevention education curriculum. We start up in 6th grade and we go through 10th. We do other lessons, bystanders and things like bystander intervention lessons and things like that at the collegiate level. But we like to highlight that just because you sitting in class having a conversation with myself or my coworker Sophie or my supervisor Zara, just because it's very easy for you to imagine what you would do in a situation where you are confronted by violence. And the uniform answer I hear from teenagers is usually like, oh, I would hit that person. I would fight that person, right? That is the answer that we sort of move towards automatically. And it can be a struggle to help people understand, like, not only is that not necessarily what you're going to do, that's not always necessarily an option, right? And I'll sometimes say, what if that person is a family member? What if that person is a staff member here at this school? What if that person is a doctor, right? What are we going to do in a situation where somebody has power over us? We need to be thinking outside the box and not just like, why didn't the victim of violence punch harder, right? Because in that sort of lens, from this lens, which is in essence victim blaming, right? We're saying this person should have yelled louder, fought harder, just left, right? When we're approaching things from that angle, we're doing ourselves a disservice too, because we're leveling an unrealistic expectation on ourselves. And we all know stories of military, law enforcement officers, firefighters, surgeons freezing in front of procedures they've done 100 times. You know, we know stories of people lifting cars off of children who do not consider themselves very strong and able individuals. My mom last weekend told me a story. She's a teacher. She's a high school teacher. She was driving one of her students home after their choir practice, and what she found was a house where the door was open and the car was in the driveway and there was no response. And my mom, who is going to retire this year, who is a cancer survivor with a lung and a half, hopped out of that car and told that teenager to stay put and that she would figure out what was going on. And she was telling me this story, and she said, I don't know what I thought I was going to do. Right? She said, I have no idea. I knew I could be walking into danger and everything was fine, but we don't always know that. Sometimes our instincts take over, right? They're not something that we can predict when we're sitting here in a neutral environment, presumably not in crisis. I have this bear here because I'll ask folks in presentations, you think you could outrun this bear? You think you could outfight this bear? Probably not. But people do try. Some people don't make it, and some people do. It's not always logical. Go ahead, Dee.
On the screen, I see what is trauma. Am I supposed to be seeing a bear?
Uh-oh. Yeah. It didn't take you.
It didn't move a slide.
Huh. Okay, 1 second. Is it go now? Did it go now?
No. There we go. I see trauma-informed services. Trauma is the rule, not the exception.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for letting me know. I'm glad I mentioned the bear. So this is what we were mentioning just a minute ago. Trauma can come from all different services. And thank you so much for drawing my attention to that there.
Well, you said a bear. I'm like, there's not a bear on the screen.
No, I'm cracking up. Here's your bear. This should be correct. Have you got it?
Quite. It's not quite here yet, but that might be my internet taking its sweet time.
All right. Let's see. Yeah, you're right. It is behaving strangely. Does anybody in the chat see the bear? No, still trauma-informed services. All right, just 1 second. Let me find.
There's the bear.
Oh, you great!
Now we see the bear. Oh, that's a pretty bear too.
Yeah, absolutely right. I'm glad it came around. All right, I might move off my presenter view for the moment just to make sure that it behaves. Give me just a second. I will represent it here. Uh-huh. All right.
There you go.
And okay. And I'm not sure where they put my notes, but I'll just go for it. So as I said, what we do, this is a deeply ingrained response. I mean, historically, we split this into your fight or flight response. Sometimes you hear folks adding fawn or freeze or appease or any of these. Befriend, I've also heard as crisis responses. You can boil it down any way that you want. In truth, all that we're looking at is the body's desperate attempt to stay alive. Now, how does this manifest in teen dating violence, right? That means if somebody who's sexually harassing me comes a little too close one time, that student may hit that person. That student may get aggressive. That student may freeze up, right? In that moment of crisis, we don't know what's going to do. But in the case where that student is responding to violence with that fight response, with that agitation and aggression, they both get hauled down to the office a lot of the time, right? They're both getting in trouble. And before we even can acknowledge the impact of trauma and understand why that child might be behaving that way, a lot of the administrative staff, and this is no hate to the administrative staff, right? What they're seeing is, zero tolerance. We're not going to tolerate violence at the school. It doesn't matter the circumstances. But that brings us right back to square one, right? Where we're asking people to asking adolescents to overcome millions of years of biological crisis response to situations that have been placed on them through circumstances beyond their control, right? That response may not be what they would want to do. It's not a question of you knew better. It's not a question of you shouldn't have done this, right? And of course, there's a line to everything. But this is another way to look at it, because that student who gets scolded at the office is not going to tell their caregiver the whole truth at home a lot of the time, unless they're already confident that the caregiver is going to be listening to them and sympathizing with them. So, mentioned before, we're going to talk about ACEs. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you're good, Emil.
Oh, okay. So I'm not going to go into all the details on ACEs. I think many of us have heard of this before. If you have not, check out the CDC's page. I think they have a really great one. There are a myriad of both risk and protective factors, but really, if we boil down the whole list, what we're looking at is the negative health impacts of adverse childhood experiences, right? Can be mitigated by the presence of safe and supportive environments and people around young children, right? Around anybody under 18, including teenagers, right? So that might be the person down the street they've known their whole life who is a safe, supportive individual. That might be a school that is supportive of those people. That might be a really bad area to live in, but a very loving family, right? That might mean the death of a parent, but other factors that help them meet their behavioral health needs. Those are so important. We can't just look at the negative side, all these things that a kid, quote unquote, has stacked against them, right? When in reality, these are correlates, right, of negative health outcomes. These are things that are associated with those outcomes. It is not, the red, it's not the scarlet letter, right? It's not the Pirates of the Caribbean black mark on you. These are not the sole determinants of somebody's health. I see a lot of helping professionals do their ACEs quiz and then get really scared. It is okay. Not a lot of those quizzes and surveys take into account the impact of the positive things in somebody's life, which are so important, right? And you can be some of that positive influence in folks' lives by being safe and supportive, by identifying needs, not just in your child's life, but also looking outward, right, at the community, right, at the supportive systems you have around you. How can you beef that up? How can you make that better? Am I talking, right, to my friends and family about mental health challenges? Am I talking about anti-violence work? Am I broaching this in a realistic and grounded way in a space that is non-judgmental? Having these conversations before it becomes a crisis, so that if there is a crisis, which we'll get into the statistics in just a minute, we already know we're a family where we can talk about these things. We're a family where if you need help, you can come for help, because maybe you can do these things alone, but it would be much easier if you didn't have to. And I think that is a wonderful sentiment to walk away with. We don't want people to have to feel like they must go it alone. For some victim survivors, that's their choice, right? That is honestly what they want. But we can't say that and not acknowledge the shaming and the pressure of the whole culture that we're in. So I really like Love is Respect. We use it when we're developing a lot of our youth outreach information. I also pulled some youth risk behavior surveillance system data here. What they found is that 1 in 10 teens reported experiencing specifically sexual dating violence in the 12 months prior to when the survey came out, which was in 2021. I boiled it down to 2020-21. That is incredibly high. I mean, if you have a teenager, you probably know at least 10 of their friends. And again, you're looking statistically at the whole picture, right? It's not, maybe your kid does not get victimized, but maybe their best friend does, right? So there is a real fear about engaging with anti-violence information, because there is an anxiety that, like, well, people should really be just talking about this with their own kids. And I will tell you, the abusive parents are not doing that. I would love it if Peace Line was totally redundant and every family was educating their children on what sexual assault is and what healthy boundaries are and what communication looks like. But the fact of the matter is, if I'm an abusive parent, I'm not going to stop abusing my child to explain how the abuse I'm doing is wrong and traumatizing, right? I may not even have the language to do that again. That just may not be something that I was afforded the benefit of ever getting. 1 in 3 adolescents overall in the United States, this is from Love is Respect as well, experience dating violence in any form. So if we're looking between these two statistics, we can see massive, massive rates of victimization. There's a very low disclosure. Part of that is because a lot of behaviors I would term abusive, or y'all might term abusive as peer professionals in this field, young people will term toxic or unhealthy, or they will fit it under another label. And it's really important as you're hearing young people use these ever-changing buzzwords and things like that in slang to be like, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? Maybe it's lame to explain it to your caregiver, right? But it starts a conversation. These conversations do get less awkward as you continue to have them, right? Opening that door is so important. You do not want that first awkward conversation to be after your child has experienced violence or after their best friend has just been assaulted. Because a lot of kids, when, again, I survey a random class in Floyd, like a lot of these kids have stayed up all night trying to help their kids work through a crisis with little to no resources of their own. Love is Respect is a really great one because it's self-directed. If you're listening to me say this and you're thinking, my teenager's not going to listen to me, I agree. Like, when I was a teenager, I would listen to anybody but my parents, anybody but my teachers. But if they put resources in front of me, or if it came from a guest lecturer, or if it came from another adult like my uncle, right, then I might listen, right? You have to know what works for your family, for your unit. So again, as I was saying, maybe not your kid, but a lot of kids. I wanted to highlight the risks and prevalence of intimate images being sent around. This is a 2021. This is more 2021 data. This was a meta study. What they are what they found rather, is that sexting or sending nudes underage is becoming more common, right? And this is not a problem that's unique to the age of cell phones, because people were certainly, they had their Polaroids before that, right? And we had paintings even hither to that. But at each step of this process, it has become easier and easier and easier to create those images and to disperse those images. So often this needs to be a conversation around cybersecurity and an understanding of what you put. Maybe, yes, your girlfriend sent this image to you. You're not going to send it to anybody else. What if you lose your phone, right? What if somebody hacks your account? Do we hear about people hacking into your accounts? What can we do to keep you safe? What is the safest choice that you can make for you? Who gets in trouble, right? Who gets in trouble when this happens? The other part of this is that sometimes the only narrative that these kids hear is that taking nudes is illegal, which is true. But if all they ever hear is taking nudes is illegal and police officers want to know if you're being blackmailed, that leaves the door wide open for any adult predator, especially, or abusive partner to say, and if you report that I'm blackmailing you, you're also a criminal and you're going to get this charge, and this charge. I would say that in the cases that I have seen with the law enforcement officers and investigators that I have spoken with, that is not the case. They are way more worried about children being exploited than they are about a kid who made a choice that maybe wasn't the most intelligent, right? That's a kid's job, is to perhaps not be the most intelligent until hopefully they're grown up. That's what childhood is for. On average, what they found in these studies, as I said, was that 14.8% of young people under 18, were sending sex nudes, right? Whereas receiving, almost a third of students received it. 12.0, so they're just 12, I could have just said 12, and 8.4% of people forwarded those images or had that image forwarded without their consent. We really don't like that. That is intimate image exploitation, is the term that we would use. But if you're, again, this is a situation where the narrative that young people are hearing is, hey, don't do this, it's illegal. But if you ask them, they almost all know somebody who has already done it, or perhaps had this done to them. That is a really important point. It's easy to say, well, my kid wouldn't do that. My kid would, that's not what they're interested in. Like, my kid's too young for that. Have a conversation beforehand, because it could be their best friend. If your kid has more than 3 friends, right, statistically, you may run into this. And this cuts across socio-demographic factors, right? This is a problem of modern society to some degree because of how accessible it is, but it's not that kids have changed really at all from 1970. It's just easier. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions on this before we go on? I know I'm a prolific speaker.
I do want to say I have put like the CDC link and the Love is Respect link in the chat so that folks can copy those and bookmark stuff for them. But it's surprising how many um, kids unwittingly, unknowingly, they're part of a friend group or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, a private chat group, and they think, well, nobody's going to see
Or it's
this.
here.
But
Yeah.
once it's out there, it's not going away. Trying
Right.
to get these images pulled down is next to impossible because they get forwarded over and over and over and over again.
Once that cat is out of the bag, it is extremely hard. And
It's
that
right
is
back
not
in the bag.
just kids. That is, some of it is based on deceptive messaging from some of these platforms like Snapchat brands itself saying these messages are going to go away. To Snapchat, I'm pretty sure that is more of a high school thing at this point. I don't know how many middle schoolers are really using Snapchat. It's mostly the high school and college students who are really doing it. But Snapchat tells you these go away. They don't. They're stored, right? But that's not what the website is telling you. And as I used to tell this to students, I could see the horror in their eyes. What we really want to do when we're thinking about intimate image exploitation, blackmail, and things like that, digital exploitation of young people, is to really be careful about the messages that we're sending about victim blaming. Well, this person was just stupid and they shouldn't have done it, right? The problem is not that they're kids making kid decisions. The problem is the exploitation, right? And it does put them in a legally precarious position. You have to acknowledge that. You have to be transparent and truthful. That is an obligation that we have to our other humans in this world, right? But that is so much less of a problem than somebody trying to use this against you.
And reminding kids that everybody knows how to take a screenshot.
Yes.
So, even if Snapchat makes it go away, if I open it and screenshot it while it's open,
what are you going to do? Right.
I've got the screenshot of it. Snapchat might have lost it, but it's personally on my phone now.
Mm-hmm.
I can do what I
Exactly.
want to with it.
Exactly. And it's really frustrating because there are many, many people who set out to do things like that and say, oh, well, send it to me on Snapchat and it'll disappear. And then they screenshot it. Of course, Snapchat tells you, but what are you going to do about it? Well, I do have something you can do about it, but we'll get to that. So at the Women's Resource Center, the lens that we look at most violence with, and this encompasses, I would say, far upwards of 90% of the cases that I've personally seen and worked with, we look at violence through the power and control lens. So again, I mentioned blackmail towards teens before. It can be really difficult, especially if you have a teen who's marginalized in some way. Maybe they, have an intellectual disability. Maybe they're a member of a racially marginalized group or marginalized faith group or something like that. They're in a small town, right? Status is really an effective method of manipulating somebody. Most of us have probably seen in our adult lives families and friend groups split and take sides when there is a breakup, when there's abuse taking place, because one thing that most abusers are pretty good at is manipulation, right? We live in a society, again, where we want to be forgiving and we want to be considerate, and that those are not bad things, but they can also keep people hooked into cycles of power and control. With teenagers especially, we see a lot of threats of suicide, which are always a high concern. A lot of real guilt tripping, like, I'm going to kill myself if you try and leave me. And I've had multiple students approach me personally and say, this is the situation I was in with my ex. What am I supposed to do? I have to keep talking to them. We're still broken up, but they need me or they're going to kill themselves. What I say is that, look, when you are suicidal and you go to a behavioral health unit, they don't just assign one person to look out for you 24/7, right? There's a whole staff of people who are trained in this, trained in stabilization. That is not your responsibility. You are not qualified, furthermore, right? Regardless of what your ex is saying, for instance, right? That is not something you can physically do no matter how bad you want to. And you need to reach out to the adults in the room. You need to reach out to people who can give them that service, because it isn't fair for them to be asking it of you. But they shoulder that responsibility. And they'll take it on regularly. Teenagers have a reputation for being irresponsible. it really depends on the responsibility in question, right? A lot of them have a lot of stuff that they just don't even think to share. Partner violence, trafficking, stalking, sexual violence all rely on an abuser's use of power and control to harm another party, right? That is a choice an abuser is making. It is not the fault of the victim. We always try to be very, very explicit about that. Any of us have the capacity to abuse. We are choosing not to, right? Abusers choose to use the power that they have to harm other people. You can have the two exact same sets of situations. One ends in abuse, the other does not, right? Based on the choices of the perpetrator, not the victim. So I would love to hear from the chat here. What forms of power and control do you think are most readily recognized by outsiders, number one, and by victims, survivors of violence, teenage victims, survivors of violence? Or if you want to toss out the ones you think are not recognized, that's also good. And D, if you could check that too. I'm scared to click away from this and have it break again.
Right. And I just put in the chat, one of the things that's readily recognized is physical abuse. People see bruises. Okay,
Mhm.
that's an obvious.
Yeah.
That's real obvious. If I see you black and blue, what happened?
Right.
Kind of thing. You know, if I see teenagers with broken arms and broken fingers and bruises,
Mhm.
intimidation, if we witness it, yes, that, thank you, Tammy, for that.
Yes, absolutely. If you witness it, right? I think it might be. Oh, it's not Love is Respect. It is the One Love Foundation just released a really good series of video on digital intimidation and manipulation too. That has people on their phones texting an abuser, right? But the camera is approaching a door, and as it's approaching this door, you hear the text read out as if it's a conversation. And it's really jarring, even for me, who like talks about this all the time and discusses this all the time. It's really jarring how readily we would see some of these behaviors as unacceptable, right? But that seem less bad when they come through text. Intimidation, yes. Well, you're shoving against a locker. All of those things are very readily visible. The guilt tripping, not so much. Financial control, not so much. Emotional abuse is hard even for adult victim survivors to pin down a lot of the time. The isolation, really, really common with teenagers. I want to draw attention to the fact that if you're not having healthy sexuality, healthy relationships, conversations with your teenagers, and you know they're not getting it, through Teen Connections or through Peaceline or something like that, if they're not getting it from there, it's not that they're not getting it at all. They're getting it off TikTok. They're pulling 50 Shades of Grey off your bookshelf. They're on AO3. They're getting messages about relationships and what relationships should look like. They just might not be getting them from you. And that is a scary thought. And that is how we have students, when we're doing values exercises, say that they want partners that are possessive, right? Saying that that is a desirable trait. Now, to me, as an anti-violence advocate, that is really scary, right? But we have to take our time and say, okay, well, what does that mean to you? Because a lot of times what these young people are trying to express is, I want to feel valued, I want to feel loved, but they are associating those behaviors with possessiveness and often with violence. Let me erase that.
Chat is very quiet today, but that's okay.
That's all right. I love to talk. So speaking of that, right, associating those behaviors with romance, like with something that is attractive, what we see in adult and teen survivors is our cycle of violence. This is just approximation. It's a average way that this often goes. It tends to intensify as time goes on. The incidences of violence, which can be any form of violence, we're from verbal, physical, sexual, emotional, anything. This tends to become more intense as time goes on, and sometimes it moves in reverse, right? Sometimes a relationship is primarily tension and violence, or calm and then sudden acts of violence and things like that with very little warning. But this is the sort of typical cycle that we see. Usually what will happen is in the sort of honeymoon or calm phase after violence takes place, there are promises to change. And again, we want to believe our partners. We want to think that when somebody says, I'm so sorry, I'll never do that again, that they really mean it and they're capable of change. We want to be there for them. We want to forgive. We want to support. Those are all good pro-social impulses that are being used against us in the context of an abusive relationship. And it doesn't really matter what value you can think of, because obviously, we want young people to have values, right? In general, we hope that they have standards for behavior and hopes and goals, that things that they aspire to, right? But if your ideals, it doesn't matter whether it's freedom or it doesn't matter whether it's forgiveness and tolerance, like those can be used against you, because we have to remember that's not the stranger danger. That's statistically the risk to young people. It is our partners, it is our friends, it is our family, it is the partners of family members, it is acquaintances, it is workplace associates, all of these things. It's not really the creepazoid in the white van or the bushes that we kind of like to imagine is the prescient risk to young people. But that's statistically not really the case. Even in cases like trafficking, for folks under 18, the vast majority of trafficking perpetrators, the number one is family. That is something to be aware of when we're talking about violence. We can't just boil it down to these outsiders are coming for you. It's not like that. It's people because they know what your values are, right? And they know you, and they know what you're vulnerable to, and they know what's important to you, and they know what you would tell about, and they know what you won't tell about. Going back to our previous slide, I can't say how many victim survivors I have personally seen that will detail high risk, very violent behaviors. They might say, oh, this person has strangled me. This person uses sexual violence against me. This person tracks me everywhere I go on Life 360. This person has done all these horrible things and threatened my children. This person leaves firearms out on the counter, and say, but he's never punched or slapped me, right? Because that's the line in the sand. That's the line in the sand that they know that they would never tolerate that. All these other things, less recognition, less understanding, right? We miss the forest for the trees. So these are principles of trauma-informed care. We use them at our center. They are considered best practices, right? I would take this one step further. A lot of the things that I think are best practices, probably for agencies like ours, which are dealing with complex behavioral healthcare needs a lot of the time, are also probably best practices in family too, or at least you can take it under advisement, right? People should be safe, whether they're in their family or they are in their care provision agency, their hospital, their counselor's office, doesn't matter, their school. We should understand and respect what the rules are, and it should be clear what the rationale for those rules are. This is a great way. If you have if you have a teenager who has a curfew, for instance, having a transparent conversation where you're actually listening to that child's input about what it is and explicitly explaining why you do this, what you're scared of, what the paradigms would have to be. Nobody wants to get in constant fights with somebody else. Teenagers honestly just have not been exposed to a lot of this rationale and logic. And it's good for us too, right? As people who are looking out for other folks in our lives, to be able to say, here's the risks, here's the benefits, here's how I make my choice, because you're modeling that behavior for them too. You're modeling how you're making your choices. You're accountable, right, for your choices. When you mess up, you apologize, right? You change your behavior, because that's what we want to see them do, right? Having peers that support you, extremely, extremely important. I think that there is, in service provision, a level of asymmetry of power, a level of, I would almost say, paternalism that can be really destructive to clients that are coming out of abuse, because they're in a situation where their autonomy has been taken from them, and our goal at the WRC is to restore that. And we can't do that if we're not prioritizing their needs in their own life, because ultimately they're the ones that have to live it, right? And that's true of all of us. Ultimately, we're the ones who have to live with our lives. It's not for anybody else, no matter how much we love them. People should have voice, right? We should be working together, choices about what they want to do and what they don't want to do. Now, again, there are some basic parameters, right, on that. Like, we can't always have everything that we want, of course, but we can at least have a conversation about it. And paying attention to the world around us, like what has society decided for us? This is especially important when we're talking to young women, right? Like, what is the dominant narrative demanding of you? What is it telling you? And what do you want to be? What do you want to do, right? Don't let this movie or this book or whatever decide you for you. This is very similar. This is another SAMHSA. I would encourage you, if you have time and if you have interest, to check out their website about trauma-informed care, because I think that there is a lot that we can generalize to families. Again, I sort of talked about this before when we were talking about what trauma is. understanding and recognizing that we have all experienced trauma, that it's not something that isolates us, right? Paraphrasing, I believe, Baldwin here, that is not something that isolates us, but it is something that should be a bridge, right, to other humans. It should bring us together in our understanding of the ways in which the world around us needs to change, right? And the ways in which the world around us could be better. Not, oh my gosh, I'm the only one who has suffered like this. We can be united in that. We can be together as a community. Recognizing what trauma looks like, that it can come out, especially for those of you who are educators in this chat, if there are any of you who are educators in this chat, recognizing that that can come out as very destructive behavior. Your classic victim of sexual violence at home may not be just like crying and like drawing in their notebook, right? They might be very loud and destructive. They might be acting out, and be very cautious, especially with disciplinary proceedings with those students, about what that looks like. Responding to our knowledge about the prevalence of violence by maybe evaluating our policies. Again, this is a lot for educators, administrators in the chat, if any of you are that. Thinking about what the impacts of trauma really can be, right? Considering all those negative health impacts of ACEs, considering what happens to people when they are going through crises. Does our agency afford that? Or are we all grind all the time? Do we have a culture of valorous self-sacrifice that demands that of people? And then we turn around to our clients and we say, self-care, right? Have we created institutional care, right, for the other people in our community? Because we're going to spend a lot of our lives at work. We're going to spend a lot of our lives at school. We need to be accountable for how we're treating those. And that's part of the resisting re-traumatization, right? Not feeding into a culture that silences and stigmatizes, but rather empowers. So how to talk about trauma. A lot of us got your classic, if anything bad ever happens to you, you can come and tell me. That's really great advice, but it can kind of blindside people. So low impact disclosure was developed for helping professionals, and then I immediately took it and I started teaching it to like all the college students I talked to, because I found it so useful to give folks an actual paradigm that, again, prioritizes consent. Right? We're having that conversation where we're saying, hey, we just got out of this presentation from Emil Morse's Women's Resource Center that talked all this about sexual violence, that talked all this about partner violence, all this about power and control. I'm reflecting on my life. Do you have time for a serious conversation right now? And then that person who loves you because they love you and they probably have time will almost certainly say yes. And if they don't, remembering that we respect that no, and that is a great time for us to reach out to those other agencies, for us to call our hotline, reach out to the text line, reach out to the chat line, all of those things. That is taking part in community. All of these agencies like mine, you pay taxes. We're funded by state and federal grant. You're already entitled to our services. You've already paid for it. Don't let your fear of taking it, quote unquote, taking it away from somebody else ever make you hesitate. We want to hear from you. We want to know what's going on. If you call us before the crisis, it is so much easier to de-escalate and defuse potential danger than after, oh my God, my child is being blackmailed, right? We want to know in the foreground, right? So that we can help connect you to resources that you want, that you need. Anyway, but in all likelihood, they're going to say, yes, of course, you can talk to me anytime. You're my loved one. Let's go, right? And we say, all right, this is what I want to talk about. For example, again, using students walking out of my presentation as an example, they might say something like, oh my gosh, I'm really reflecting on one of my previous relationships that I had in middle school. I always thought it was so toxic. I didn't consider that it was abusive, right? Can I talk about that with you? So now we've not only asked if it's a good time to have that serious conversation, and given the genre of conversation that we're going to have, we've forewarned and forearmed that conversational partner that it's serious and what the topic is, because we don't know what other people's lives are. Remember, we're being trauma informed. We don't know if that person has specific triggers or traumas that they're trying to work through as well. But in all likelihood, again, they'll say yes. And they often will want to listen to you. I cannot promise everybody is a responsible steward of trauma, right? Not everybody has gone out of their way to delve into healthy communication styles and communication methods. People have different boundaries, different cultural backgrounds, different perspectives on how we should deal with trauma. Can't promise that, but you can do your due diligence, right? So with the consent of this other party, we can talk about what is immediately on our mind. The other point that people tend to trip up at is that they want to give like this whole cohesive narrative, this whole like victim impact statement. And that's really not always the way we process things. Often it's more emotion first, and we are working through and creating a narrative around those events as we're discussing them. Sometimes we don't have that narrative until we are verbalizing it. That's very, very common with young people. It's very, very common with people who aren't young too, right? Talking through things, turning your thoughts into a narrative is a whole therapeutic process, right? And people's perspectives on those things may change. So really, it's a 3-step process with a 1B, if it or 1/2B, if the other person just isn't ready to hear that and receive that. All right, so I mentioned it before, non-consensual intimate image exploitation. There is a good resource for that. So the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has put up what they call Take It Down, which is an image hashing service specifically geared towards people under 18. There is a reciprocal service for people who are over 18 and are concerned about their intimate images being used against them in some form. It is free. They don't save your images. You just get a hash code based on the specific arrangement of data in that file. Because remember, anytime we're dealing with a computer, we're just dealing with zeros and ones. So even your screenshots, even your edited photos and things like that, a lot of those will get caught in this way. And what they do is they continuously scan and survey their participating platforms. Those are a lot of safe for work social media platforms and a lot of not safe for work platforms. I mean, even Pornhub participates in NCMEC's Take It Down. YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, right? OnlyFans all participate. So if you have somebody who's under 18 who wants to keep their images off of these, let's say they have a vengeful ex who keeps threatening to upload these, right? This can help to not only link them to National Center for Missing and Exploited Children resources, but to automatically take that down. A lot of people will just tell you DCMA it, right? Doesn't work that way. It's illegal content, right? But if you're over 18, a lot of times people just say DCMA it. The problem with DCMAs being that if you get counterclaimed on that copyright claim, your address and full name can be exposed. Again, in a digital era, if this is your ex-husband, right, who is stalking you, and this is actually just bait to make you claim your stuff, file a claim with that platform, tell them to take it down, right? That can be very dangerous. You don't necessarily want your address and name exposed. So I mentioned forensics before. This is a picture I took at the Carillion exam room. I always like to have this in here for our purposes to say that, if you're in Virginia, and I think most other states as well, these kits are free. The medications are free. If somebody's experienced sexual assault, all that imaging is free. It's domestic violence assaults are reimbursed through, I don't want to say the Victims Fund. I don't think that's correct, but they are reimbursed through the state. Deirdre probably knows. Those can also be done without the involvement of law enforcement. If you just want evidence collected while you decide what to do, that is a-okay. This is really important information to have when people are coming to you and saying, hey, I experienced a sexual assault. I don't know what I want to do. I don't know if I want to report it. Give them a grounded sense of what it looks like, what this room looks like. This is the real New River Valley room, right? And I would encourage you, again, if you're an educator, if you are at all in contact with people, call your local forensics department, ask about it. Can I get a picture? Do I have an understanding of what this process looks like before there is a crisis, so that I can be that person who says, no, this is what it looks like, right? It's not like Law and Order SVU, right? It is a trauma-informed process as best as it can. Let them know their expectations so that they can exercise their rights. Again, law enforcement is always happy to go and pick those up. If people are hesitant for other reasons with law enforcement, one of the ways that I found around that is to link people up with a specific detective. Now, that might be youth services. That might be specifically like a sexual assault, domestic violence detective. If they're just scared of calling a random road officer to their house, that doesn't necessarily preclude them being able to collaborate with law enforcement officers. So that's something to bear in mind as well.
Yes, Emil. Victims who are getting a perk test done should not be billed by the hospital
Yes.
And if they do get billed by the hospital, the local advocate can work with VVF, and VVF will make it go away. It gets paid for by a part of separate funding, but and it depends on what services are done as a part of the examination. And you know, they now can do special x-rays, CAT scans, MRIs. There are different pieces that before weren't done, but we have to bill it and code it accordingly for VVF to take over, making sure it comes out of the right pool of money and that the
Yes.
victims are not billed for these other things.
Right, absolutely. Because the other concern that I often hear is confidentiality, and that's from our 16 to 24-year-old students a lot of the time, where they're dating and they've experienced sexual assaults, and they're very concerned about their confidentiality. They want to have that conversation with the person who perhaps holds their insurance on their own time, if it is even safe to have that conversation with the person who holds their insurance. The only exception I think to that is public insurances. Like, so if you know victims who have TRICARE, Medicaid, Medicare, I think that those get billed first before VVF, Virginia Victims Fund. Um, but yeah, I've been on a lot of these calls personally. Nurses are always wonderful. Patients are always wonderful. Our goal as emergency advocates in this place, in this situation, is to make sure the victims know their rights, that they're respected, they're supported, to turn this process that can be lengthy and traumatizing, not to the fault of the nurses, just because of what's being discussed, into another just simply inconvenient doctor's appointment. And if we can do that, then I consider that a victory. So I mentioned strangulation. A couple of our children's counselors have expressed to me that they're concerned about rising strangulation rates among young people. That is an anecdote. I don't know that there is any data to back that up, but what I would say is that the majority of strangulations don't leave marks. This meta study found rates between 17 and 93% of strangulations not showing visible injury, but with CT, they found injury 77% of the time. This is something that teenagers will consensually participate in. This is sometimes associated with suicide attempts. This is sometimes associated with other just sort of experimentation. It is also associated with domestic violence. It is associated with sexual assault. And it can be way more dangerous than people know, because people often think, well, there's no bruises. Again, like going back to those easily recognized forms of violence, right? If there's no bruises, then I must be okay. That's not necessarily true. You always want to, especially if you're having any dizziness or anything like that, to have imaging done to make sure that you're not experiencing vascular dissection or another one of these rare but very serious complications. There is a real lack of informed consent when it comes to the risks of strangulation and what to look for, and how dangerous it really is. So I should say, Alliance for Hope is the parent organization of the Strangulation Training Institute, which has really great information, but not a very trauma-informed logo. So I did not use their logo. I used their parent companies here. The question that we encourage like EMTs to ask, things like that, is phrased not "has someone strangled you?" because people associate that with being strangled to death, right? We want folks to ask, has somebody put pressure on your neck or throat or made it difficult for you to breathe in any way, right? If you hear that has happened to somebody during the course of an assault, right? That is something to look at and something to be aware of. All right. When we're responding to people that have experienced violence, because I have, just as I have information on disclosing violence, I have information about receiving violence, right? Explain the purpose of what you're doing. Again, going back to those SAMHSA principles of trauma-informed care, it has to be mutual. Be respectful of that person's space. Remember, their autonomy has been violated in some way, and you want to restore as much of that dignity as possible, right? Verify that you have consent to touch or move them, hug them, all of those things. Check in with people, ask. Sometimes they don't realize when they're getting re-traumatized, especially if they're in that crisis state. They might be totally shut down, and they may not even realize that that's happening until you prompt them, right? Hey, are you doing all right? You look kind of checked out. It's okay to ask those questions. It's helpful to ask those questions. It brings people awareness to their emotional state. If we were talking with our friends or family, people we're caring for, all those things, really a lot of what this boils down to is non-judgmental and careful listening to people, being, again, very explicit, but the fact that you believe them because you should, right? This is not your fault if they experience violence, because it isn't, right? Violence is a choice that the perpetrator makes, not the victim. Affirming what they're feeling, it also helps, if you have somebody telling you about this violent incident and they seem very upset and angry, it is okay to be like, you seem frustrated. Because it might be like, I'm not, I'm sad, right? Sometimes people process things differently. It comes out differently. Asking those questions can help you avoid misunderstanding. I would, however, caution against asking questions about, like, prompting more information about what happened. We always, again, with EMTs we train, with officers we train, and things like that, we tell people to, especially with young kids, avoid prompting and soliciting information. If they want to tell you things, thank you for trusting me, I'm sorry you went through that, how are you feeling, right? But not be like, and then what happened, right? And then what happened? Did this person do it? This person do it? Leave that to the CAC. DSS can make referrals to that. Law enforcement can make referrals to that. We can't, as a dual service sexual domestic violence agency, make referrals to that. Wish we could. We can't. But they are wonderful partners that do a really good job of making it so that a child only has to talk about these horrific and traumatic incidences as little as possible, just once, not retelling over and over and over, these things that happen potentially in a not so welcoming police room, right? We want to avoid that for our victims of violence. Everybody's situations, everybody's priorities and values are different. Respect what they want. Listen to what they want. Ask what's important to them. Ask what is your ideal outcome, is a question I ask a lot of victims I'm talking with. What would you like to see happen in a perfect world? Because one person might say, I want to chuck that perpetrator in jail for the rest of her life. And the other person might say, I just wish she'd say she was sorry, right? It totally depends. It all has to do with how that individual is processing their own situation. And of course, do what you're doing already, continuing to learn, develop your opinions, learn about best practices on topics of power and violence, because it's relevant to all of us, unfortunately. All right, so here's my information. If you want to send me an email, you can also call our hotline. I have my own survey that my grant people like me to do. But thank you for your time today. I hope I'm not too far over. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
You are not over. We are scheduled to 1:30, so we have plenty of time
Thank
for
goodness.
um you've done very well, actually. So informative. Do we have questions? You can unmute yourself and ask questions so we can hear other voices in the room.
Thank you, Tammy. And thank you, everybody. I'm sorry I missed some people hearting their introductions, but I would heart you.
And I can tell you, if you need or want or desire the Women's Resource Center to come talk to your office for a staff meeting, or any of those kinds of things, Emil and the team are super amazing, and they do a lot of things that I've worked with them since 2017, so I've learned a lot and watched them grow and seen some of the most amazing work come out of their organization. And they're always willing to come and educate people on what is going on in the area, the trends of what is shifting and changing, as far as how things are done. So super, super amazing that way. And if everybody's had a chance for that, I am going to go back to sharing my screen so that we can bring up, let me see, share. We want to share this one. And Um, there we go. This is our survey. And this will also pop up when you log out of the Zoom meeting. It will pop up. Please help us to know about our trainings and help us to better serve you guys in the future. There, you should be able to see it now. Somebody wants to give me a thumbs up.
I
And
see it.
Emil put his link in the chat as well. Do you go out to the schools? Is it required?
That's a great question. So we do our best. During COVID, we actually lost funding. We had it through VDH. We got it back, and now we have like 1.5 people, almost 2 people, because we lost another one of our Peaceline people. Yeah, we go out to the schools. We go out to the public schools. I also present Peaceline in the libraries at times, a condensed version of that curriculum. It is not required. We, in fact, always send out a opt-out form. When I first started doing it, I was like, oh my gosh, why would anybody opt their kid out of this education? Like, it's so important. But then it occurred to me, as I worked with more people, that a lot of the people who are opting their kids out are opting their kids out because either the parents have a trauma history pertaining to sexual partner violence or the kids do. So they want to be a part of those conversations. And that's why we moved it into the library. So, and I've had, parents and adolescents come together, especially homeschool students who've left because they're experiencing trauma in the schools. And we're trying to get it into more private education settings. I mean, Dee already said it. I don't care if it's a fly fishing group. If you want me to come, I'll come and talk about violence. Like, I am very passionate about this. I think it's information that everybody could use in their lives, no matter who you are. And I really hope that we can get more anti-violence education for young people out there.
And part of parenting programs and part of church youth groups. If you have a group in the area that you work with, if it's Boy Scouts, if it's Girl Scouts, if it's Future Farmers of America, they don't care. They'll come talk to anybody. As one of my team says, give me 15 minutes and a microphone, and we will help educate you. And it's amazing what comes out of those conversations. And, I know Emil has told many a story of having a conversation with a group of kids, and the kids will give him new information of, oh, this is the latest thing that they're doing now. You'll find out about apps we didn't know existed until the kids tell you they're there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually, I mean, and it's really surprising. What I hear from a lot of these kids is they're on Roblox a lot, and many parents don't understand that Roblox is not a game, it's a platform. So that means that your kids could be doing almost literally anything with that little blocky avatar. It looks very kid friendly, it looks very kid safe. Go check it out for yourself. Make yourself an account, go play Roblox for a while, and see how long it takes you for people to sexually harass you. Because that was one of the things that I first did when I heard my students talking about Roblox, is I went and I made an account and I wandered around in the little world, and it took maybe 30 minutes before some boy was telling me about his divorced parents and his struggles in 8th grade. And I just thank God that that was me and not some freakazoid. Right? Because I was like, hey, you shouldn't share that information with people online. But like, a lot of people would not say that. Again, these kids are on AO3. They're on Roblox role playing. Like, you really don't know what they're up to. They are getting messages about relationships. If you're not giving them, they're still getting them. Disturbing as it can be.
Yes, yes. Any other questions or comments? We still have a few more minutes if you would like to ask them. Yeah, so I tried to put as many of the links of different things out there, Emil, that you had mentioned. What is AO3? Good question.
AO3 is Archive of Our Own. It is the most popular fan fiction website out there. And if you remember the days of fanfiction.net, or previous to that, if perhaps you're in your 40s or 50s and you remember the Star Trek conventions and all the books being published there, that's what you're looking at. As I said, they are consuming literature about relationships. I mean, this is not just a question of kids getting on pornography sites when they shouldn't be, right? They're accessing information about relationships and sexuality regardless. Sometimes it's written, sometimes it's illustrated, sometimes it is filmed, right? And I think it's really important that especially caregivers sort of broaden their understanding and horizons, that they're not just looking for your classic dirty magazine, that your kids can be consuming really age inappropriate material that has no context in their day-to-day life without you even noticing.
And one of the biggest tips that I've gotten from all of this training about working with kids and talking to kids about healthy relationships is if you're at home, your kids, if you want to think safety of online safety, don't allow them to play on their computers in their private bedroom. Those computers need to be in a central living space, either in the kitchen or in the den or whatever. So when you're working, cooking dinner, you're seeing what they're doing. Surprising what you see when you walk past their screen and realize who they're talking to. Don't let them have their phones in their bedroom at night. They go on the charging station in the living room. And I know that sounds like, oh my gosh, how am I going to take my teenager's phone away? How am I going to keep them safe? And it's really hard, even when you have conversations about, you and your boyfriend can't be on Live 360 because they have no reason to need to know where you are every minute of the day. But then we're not using an app to share where we're at, but they've got a location sharing
Yeah,
going
and
on. That's the same thing. And how do you check the phone and make sure that they're safe? And having those conversations about why does a 13-year-old need to know where you are?
mm-hmm. Right. Again, they're getting messaging about relationships, even if, and like, because how many parents use Life 360 to track their kids, right? And if you haven't had a conversation about what you do and why you do it, right, and what's safe and what's unsafe, and what would be inappropriate, and what you find to be appropriate, if it's not again, going back to the SAMHSA principles, if it's not a accountable, transparent conversation, why wouldn't your kid do that with their partner, right? And I think the grim reality is, my father, he's a computer scientist, right? He's taught at the university level for longer than I've been alive. He installed parental controls on our home computers. They sat, the screen facing the living room for my whole childhood. It did not stop me, right? All that taught me is how to break parental controls, right? You can't rely on an app to do a parent's job. You can't rely on a whitelist to do a parent's job. You have to participate. If you're not seeing what they're doing, if you're not participating in their world, you don't know what's happening in their world. And the answer is not control, it's transparency, right? Because if they don't feel respected, they're just going to get good at being sneaky. That's what most of us did. Kids today are no different.
Yep. Has her 4-year-old son's tablet with the children's setting for certain shows, but she has noticed something weird stuff still pops up. Yes, yes. And things that they think are children's shows, watch the content with them, because there are some that look like they're cartoons and children's shows, and they're anything but children's stuff.
Yeah, there's a phenomenon called Elsagate, right? Where because violent content and content crammed with like proprietary characters and certain themes that kids are into get prioritized in the algorithm, there's a lot of like Elsa and Spider-Man cheat on one another type content that just gets churned onto YouTube Kids by people trying to make a couple advertising dollars. Some of that is very weird, even to me as an adult. It would make me uncomfortable to watch. And again, that stuff's going to happen. Your kids are going to see content that makes them uncomfortable. They're going to read books that make them uncomfortable. They're going to see shows that make them uncomfortable. See that as a opportunity for you to have conversations about, again, like what's good, what's bad, when things make you uncomfortable, how do we talk about that? Right? You can take good messages out of those experiences that don't make the kid feel ashamed and like they need to hide that content, because that's what enables abuse, is that isolation. That's what really leaves the kid vulnerable.
Kind of goes towards the DOC principle. If you see something, say something, and teach that to your kids. If you see something that you think is really weird that's coming up, that you don't understand it, you don't like it, it wigs you out, say something to mommy, say something to dad about this came up. What is this? You know, how let them feel like it's okay to come to you and say, hey, why did this come up? Why did I see this? What does this mean? Because it may be coming to your 5 or 6 year old, not your 12-year old that has a little bit more capacity to go, oh, click out of that. It's gross.
Exactly. Right. You know, I mean, the whole thing with being in the digital age, right? The algorithmic function is really unprecedented. And it really does tend to push because, like, what happens when you're scrolling on Instagram or on Facebook Reels, YouTube, whatever, when you linger on things that are shocking or uncomfortable or that incense you, all the computer knows is that you looked at that longer. So it wants to give you more of that. So if your kid is seeing this thing that scares them and consuming that thing that scares them, as far as the computer is concerned, they're interacting with the content and they're going to recommend them more. So that it can be a really unhealthy cycle. I mean, you can, again, have these 4 and 5 year olds who are seeing pretty inappropriate and violent content uh, just because, again, the people on the other side of that screen are making money on advertising, right? That's in YouTube. That's in a lot of these social media platforms. This is really emergent technology, and we don't have good solutions for this yet, aside from continuing those conversations with your kid. And if your kid feels like they can come to you with these problems, they're going to come to you with their friends' problems too, because kids want to help one another. You know, by and large, students that we talk to are much more receptive information like when they're hearing information like, oh, this is what I can do to help my friend if they're in danger. That is a good way to get around that defensiveness. Like, well, that wouldn't happen to me. That internalized victim blaming that a lot of people, adults and kids, exhibit. You know, like, oh, okay, this is going to be useful if my friend needs shelter or if my friend needs a perk kit. You know, a perk. I always say perk kit. The K is for kit. I'm being repetitive, but this is useful if I know somebody who does this. Yeah. But yeah, thank you for all that. I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, I want to thank everybody again for attending today. I want to remind you that we have another lunch and learn on the 28th. And that will be one of our Speaker Bureau members, Natalie Purdy, will be coming and sharing her story of victimization. She was 18 years old, just graduating high school, and had been dating a guy for a while, but she was like, he wants to get really, really, really serious and really possessive. And I'm like, no, I'm fixing to go off to dance school in New York and this, that, and the other thing. I'm not ready to do the things he wants. So I want to break up with him. And he tried to kill her um, during that process with her grandmother home and, you know, people in the house. And she's got a really, really good story of how justice was found decades later. And I can't wait for you to hear her story and how her life has turned to advocacy. So that will be on February 28th at noon as well to close out Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Um, and I hope that we will get to see you guys on the 28th. And I am going to